science 4, which means that we're making a set that has 4 elements in it. 4 presentations that in time are in a sequence, but because of our transforming it, the sequence doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, but rather establishes itself 1, 2, 4, 5, and the hidden part is in the center. The hidden part in ancient mystical language was always the unsaid aspirant that you had to breathe but not say. In the Zohar, in the Jewish high mysticism, one of the curious things is that the name for Jesus has 4 letters, just like the name for Yahweh, only in the middle, between the 2 pairs, is an aspirant that is breathed but never said. All of this goes back to ancient Egypt, when the word that was used for the Supreme Spirit was pronounced with the letters NTR. And when you see it in Egyptological studies from the 19th and 20th centuries, they always put E's in there so it reads and says Neter. But in ancient mystical Egyptian wisdom, it wasn't pronounced Neter at all. It was pronounced Ntr. What shows in this is an ancient understanding that there is a pivot of transform that is not apparent in the world. And one has to, if you're using wisdom, make it apparent that you know that it's not apparent, and yet make a space for it in a silence for it to occur just the same. So that the invisible is always in the center of the visible. So if you have a square, you have 4 sides, but there's a space in the middle. If the space in the middle is defined by the 4 sides, then that space will be the square. But if the 4 sides, or even the 4 angles, are set in an infinite space, then the space inside is a continuation of the space outside into infinity, and is only by convenience then called a square, is really then a frame of attention and not a geometric thing. A friend of mine in San Francisco in the 60s, who was the founder of the great radical social program, they called themselves the Diggers after medieval mystics, and they gave free food out in Golden Gate Park. And people said, you can't do this, who can afford this? And they gave out free food to the extent of where they were feeding 1,000 people a day, and then took the food down to Market Street and gave free fresh soup and home-baked bread to all the executives coming out who were criticizing this rabble, the beat hipsters, doing all this. The founder's name was Emmett Grogan, and he has a couple of books from the 60s that were there. He used to be, when he was younger, assistant film director for Michelangelo Antonioni in Italy. And Emmett said that Antonioni used to carry a slide around with him that had no image in it, no picture. It was just the frame of the slide. And all the time while he's looking, he would hold that frame up to get the composing eye so that he would see in terms of the frame, but not to limit what he saw to what would be in the frame, but to convey that the image in the frame was a part of a field of awareness. And so Antonioni's films are extraordinary artworks because it isn't just what you see on screen, but it's the expansive quality of the infinite field that is really resonantly there. When you see La Ventura or Red Desert or some of his really great films, you don't look at what's on the screen so much as you look through the screen into a mysterious context. The Chinese always had a pentatonic 5-element scale, and their counting was always 1, 2, 3 in the middle, and then 4, 5. And it was the middle that had a very peculiar kind of a thing. Instead of being there as a point in the middle was a pivot, was an axial, an axis that could rotate. And when it rotated, the two pairs were not just two pairs, but because they rotated, because they spun, they had a dynamic symmetry that wasn't compositional in terms of geometry, but had this mysterious circulation of energy. And out of this came the understanding of qi. The qi is an energy that circulates through the body, and its circulation is not based on something like sap running, but is based upon the neural, spinal column, and brain being the pivot of the way in which the psychophysical body is always in a chirality, is always in a radiant and rotational vibration. And so harmony is the ability to come into participation with that vibration. It's difficult, except in the rarest of circumstances, to understand that science does not come from the mind. Science comes from consciousness, which is different. Science owes its genesis to vision and not to symbols. And it's not at all apparent. And for this, we have to go back to a classic wisdom for a moment to see how this builds up. Experience, because it is a flow, because it is a flow that has feeling and images and the beginnings of language, oral language, what one could exclaim, what one could say, the stories one could tell, the myths. The pivot of that is the heart. And so one is heartful in one's experience if your feelings are in tune with nature, if your images are well-founded in existence, and if your language is purely flowing in the experience of your life. And so the heart is something that can be purified, and that is to be brought back into its pivotal quality. And we call this, the technique of doing this, prayer. Prayer is for the purifying of the heart. Meditation is different. While prayer purifies the heart's experience process, meditation clarifies the mind's structure. Meditation is all about form. Prayer is about process. The prayer of the heart, the meditation of the mind. And when the mind meditates, its focus is the ultimate integral and tends to make a point rather than a pivot. It tends to come to a pointedness, and we found in the 20th century in physics, because of Einstein, because of his special theory of relativity 100 years ago, 1905, that there is a peculiarity that the universe is really a one place. It's a oneness place. And because it is a oneness place, the center of the integral, which means the center of the mind, must be a point that is unique and can be characterized as a singularity. It is a singularity that cannot be divided. It cannot be portioned out. It is oneness to the ultimate one, a singularity. It caused a great deal of difficulty throughout the 1920s and the 1930s because it was not at all apparent of just how this would work out and how this would be. Parallel to the singularity that would occur in reality as the ultimate integral was the cue for quantum theory. That energy cannot, in its dynamic, just be given an undefined, unending flow, but it must take a registry into exactness and be quantifiable. That the flow of energy in the physical universe is discontinuous, and that the discontinuity is spacing or intervaling in between things which register then as quanta, and that the ultimate quanta must be the ultimate building block upon which all existential things are made. And that this quanta then must be an extraordinarily minute, extraordinarily fertile, not even an element, but the element of which elements of elements are made, the quanta. Max Planck figured out, he didn't know the exact figure or number, but he gave it an H as a symbol for it, Max Planck's constant that is in the universe all the time that makes quanta distinct and therefore subject to being quantified. And the whole development then was, how do we find out how to quantify? How do we find out how to measure such minuteness? And at first, the minuteness was given a limit, a definitional limit of the atom, that you can't get more minute than the atom. And so if one could measure the atom, you would come to the quanta, which you could then plug into Planck's constant H of the spacing in the universe between quanta, and one would come out with the ability to really deal with the actuality of the universe, until it was discovered that there are particles smaller than an atom. And the first particle that was found was the electron. And we talked about a couple of weeks ago that the discoverer of the electron was Sir J.J. Thomson. And this was a lecture of his published years later, 1923, The Electron in Chemistry. 5 lectures delivered at the Benjamin Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. He had discovered the electron in 1896, but didn't call it the electron. Nobody knew what these were. He called it a corpuscle, a basic zit of stuff that had a negative electric charge, and because it had a negative electric charge, the only way it could be in a form at all was that there must be a positive charge someplace in that form that would balance out the negative dynamic of the electron, and this led to the discovery of the proton that carries the positive charge. And then if you have one proton and one electron, you have one atom that is primordial, the atom of hydrogen. it didn't take long for someone like Einstein, coming only 9 years after the discovery of the electron, to, because of his radical, bohemian, errant, artistic genius at not just math, but at visionary consciousness, raised to a high historical consciousness, supercharged level, that he was able to develop a cosmic form, the form of the cosmos, that he could understand, both because he was artistic in his creation out of the theory of it, but he was able to raise himself in historical consciousness to understand the analytic of it and to express it artistically in a language called higher mathematics. Really high math. Even today, 100 years later, very difficult to really appreciate, because one of the qualities that was there of the cosmos was not only that there are singularities in the universe, but that there is infinity in the cosmos. And this was an extraordinarily challenging thing. And Einstein, when he was young and developing these things, was the first person to ever, on this planet, understand that he was dealing with peculiarities. On the one hand, there are quanta. But in the universe, then, there must be quanta that are the ultimate integrals of things into singularities. And it wasn't until about 60 years later that someone gave the name to some of these singularities as black holes. So one of the books that we're taking is Black Holes and Time Warps, Einstein's Outrageous Legacy, by Kip Thorne, who's over at Caltech for many, many years, doing research to find gravitational waves. Because in Einstein's art, he understood that if you're dealing with specific quantifiable bits, the quanta of things, you have to be able to set them in a field which can also be quantized. But how are you going to quantize the field? This is going to be a very difficult thing to do. And he got his cue from two professors, one of them who had taught him in Zurich when he was just a young college student starting, Hermann Minkowski, and the other was a venerable Dutch mathematician named H.A. Lorentz. And they figured out between the two of them that there needs to be a different kind of space from the geometric space that the old classic Greeks, the classic Romans, the medieval scholastics, that everybody was using space as if it were just the only space that there is. And Minkowski space posited for the first time that you have to have a four-dimensional continuum of space-time, that time cannot be separated from space, that occurs together as a field, and that space-time is a field. And Einstein was understanding we can't just depend upon Planck's constant. We can't depend upon the kinds of geometrical identities that we've depended on for thousands of years. There must be some other way to give a tether to what is almost an insoluble problem. How are you going to visualize an infinity or a singularity when your mind blanks out exactly where the integral comes together to just oneness, because the mind then is completely just there, and there's nothing left over to know of it, to think of it. And the same for infinity, because it has no bounds, no boundaries whatsoever, that one can't think it. One can't think oneness nor infiniteness so that one has to do something other than think. And it occurred to Einstein when he was 5 years old. His father showed him a compass. And Einstein, being Einstein even at 5, the image of the compass, he couldn't get out of his mind that there are invisible forces. Now, you can't see them, but they're sure there. And then when he was 12, he had this revelation that most of the religious arguments that were going on were like opinions of people, and they weren't really grounded in any actuality, and that if God was anything, he was actual. And so from age 12 on, with that 5-year-old mysteriousness, Einstein became a very peculiar figure. He became like the Picasso of science. He was interested in not following anyone, but in taking elements and bits from different people and putting them together in his own composition. And in doing so, he retuned himself to be both an introvert whenever he was thinking, and then he realized that he was not thinking, that he was doing something else. Because being Einstein, being a mystical artist, he realized that he wasn't using just his mind with symbols, but that he was using an expansion that had been pulled through the openness of his mind into a new kind of a space. And that it wasn't just perhaps the space of Euclid, but maybe provisionally he thought it must be Minkowski's space-time that's going on here, that I'm using the whole field of space-time. And he began to look at things in this way. It wasn't until later that he realized that it was a conscious space-time and was like an invisible space within space. Not just within space, but within space-time. And that space-time then was like a fabric which could be viewed from the perspective of an expanded consciousness. And when he did, he realized that there was a correlation between a constant which was right at the center of the electromagnetic spectrum, and that is visible light. One of the presuppositions that stuck with him, not so much because of a religious dogma or of a traditional doctrine, but because of a very deep realization in himself: man is made in the image of God. Not a religious statement, but an actuality. And if man is made in the image of God, then the eyes that see invisible light, that focus on a single object, there must be something in that optic process that is ultimately real and is indexable then of everything else. And this is how he came to understand that light, if we could find the quanta of light, what is the smallest particle that makes up light? Or what is the smallest wave frequency that makes up light? And Einstein led to the development of the discovery of the photon. The electron is part of the atomic structure and has a very identifiable energy to it, and cannot just be anywhere, but can only be in specific, exact frequency locations in the space of the atom. And that while the hydrogen atom has just one electron, by the time you get to helium, the next element, it jumps from 1 to 4. It jumps to the fact that you now have 4 electrons. And it means that the nucleus doesn't have just a proton, but it turns out that it must have 4 particles. And then all of this got scrambled together and was finally solved by Ernest Rutherford and Niels Bohr the very next year after Thomson's lecture at the Benjamin Franklin Institute. Niels Bohr's teacher, Ernest Rutherford, gave the lecture, 1924, The Natural and Artificial Disintegration of the Elements, the centennial of the founding of the Franklin Institute, 1924. And later on, Rutherford, what turned out to be the end of his life, his last book, The Newer Alchemy. One can transmute elements because it happens in nature, but it happens in nature not from the beginning of the development, but from the end of the natural development coming back. That the last element, uranium, will, in time, decay through specific stages. And as it does through these specific stages that can be quantized, can be measured in terms of time, in terms of energy, in form, and that these stages are specific. And the specific stages, of course, are outlined here by Rutherford in The Newer Alchemy, and he gives a little chart on page 7 that shows exactly, even by 1937, it was understood, this is how it works. It goes from uranium through several different paired steps. It not only decays to go back down to a simpler nucleus, but there's a paired process to it where the electrons are staggered with that so that one doesn't just go down, one goes from element 92, which is uranium, down to a form of uranium, not U-238, but U-234, and then there is a way in which the electron makes up for a formal space, and one extra electron comes in, ionizing this atom, and eventually one gets from uranium to thorium, and then down to radium. And by the time you get there, you realize that radioactivity is a natural way that elements go back down their ladder of development, and eventually, given world enough, lead will be made. Einstein, in understanding that while the atom is made from a nucleus and from the electrons in their orbital array, that there must be some way that the photon and the electron interchange. There must be some way in which this is done. And all the while he was working on this, his counterpart were taking Niels Bohr and Einstein. And when Bohr was an older man, writing from his great institute in Copenhagen in a commemorative volume on Einstein, philosopher, scientist, 1949, he wrote this about concluding the discussions with Einstein. They had been through arguments and through all kinds of excursions, largely disagreeing. He said this: the lesson we have received would seem to have brought us to a decisive step further in the never-ending struggle for harmony between content and form, and taught us once again that no content can be grasped without a formal frame. and that any form, however useful it has hitherto proved, may be found to be too narrow to comprehend new experience. So that one had this very difficult quality to work with, and that is that the symbolic mind will always integrate experience. It brings experience together so that the images will make a composition, and one will, in the mind, have the imagination as a formal structure to compose those images in the imagination to make a picture. One can also compose language so that spoken language becomes symbolic and is able to be written down in symbols. Both these are integral processes where experience is brought in together. And the same with feeling. It can also be integrated so that the mind integrates experience, and when it does so, new experience colors outside of the form that you had. So you have to have a completely different frame of reference. And the difficulty is that the phrase frame of reference is itself a habitual use of language that does not allow us to appreciate the newness of the new. Whereas someone like Einstein was really an artistic genius in that he did not allow himself to get set into any kind of habits, any kind of ritual phrases, and that his experience was always kept in a free flow process so that when the mind integrated it, it integrated it in such a way that instead of being a closed form, it was a frame of reference that was open. And because it was open, it was like we were talking about earlier. If you do not enclose the center of the square in a geometric presupposition, then the space of the inner part of the square is a part of the space outside of the square as well. Because when one has an open frame of reference, one looks through not at the picture in the frame, but one looks through framedness into possibilities without end. The difficulty is that you cannot have a picture then of that initially. And that new experience, therefore, is not in the mind as a picture at all, ever. What is there is the increased energy of the presence of the unknown as an indefinite, unbounded expanse. One senses the presence of complete openness. And it was in this artistic, radical way that Einstein came to understand that what he was using was not symbols in the mind to think with, but he was using theory in a classic ancient sense. Theoria in Greek means contemplation. He was using visionary consciousness as the basis for his math and not symbolic structure in thought. And what would come out initially was not science right away, but an art form. But his poetry was not in English or German or some language like color or some language like gesture, but his artistic medium was mathematics. And so he used math like an artist would use their colors, or a poet would use his language. And when he was doing this, he realized that his theory allowed for a new kind of a form to come out, that art forms were not integral forms like the mind, but they were differential forms like a prism. And whereas the mind counts on its reference in integrals to be pragmatic, these are the steps, these are the quanta, this is what we can measure, and this is the sequence that they happen in, and that's why this integration, this idea is right, because it matches that. It brings that together. Whereas an art form is prismatic rather than pragmatic. It doesn't go by steps, it goes by resonances that are able to be expanded without distorting the previous resonances. And that the prismatic quality then of Einstein's mathematical art forms reflected back upon his person. And so Einstein's person became jewel-like. And already in the First World War era, 1914, 1916, right when the world was crashing, the Congress of Vienna solution to Napoleon's empire 100 years before came to an end and World War I broke out. Right about that time, Einstein went through a sympathy with the crashing world that left him ill for about 3 years. Problems with his liver, problems with ulcers in the stomach, problems with every part of his psychophysiology. And in doing this, at the same time, he was trying to look through the frame of his artistic spirit at the cosmos, and what kept getting interfered with there was that the obtruding mirages of a world gone mad finally led him to become ultimately honest with himself to a degree that he had been unable to ever do in his life. He realized that his wife, first wife, was not a love, that it had been like a young liaison that had just clung on, and so they separated. He realized that his whole development as a man had been limited constantly by just devoting himself to his own radical visioning, and right before him, the woman taking care of him was his cousin Elsa, who became his second wife. And Elsa was able to help Einstein not to focus, but to get into a lensing quality of prismatic expansion. And as she nursed him back to health, she nursed him back to health so that he wasn't just the kind of radical prism that he was before, but he became a very special kind of a lens that was able to see in resonant orders. And it suddenly occurred to him that the resonant orders, while they were pivotal, not focused on a point, but collected around a dynamic pivot in the electromagnetic spectrum, and that the pivot was indeed visible light in its quanta particle, the photon, which also was the ultimate wave frequency of light, which is independent of time and space. At the speed of light is always, it was measured by an American named Michelson. Albert Michelson was raised in the California gold fields, and he was a wild character. And he was one of these people that when he was a little boy, he used to watch the miners weigh their gold grains specifically to get every ounce of bucks due them. And so he became infinitely careful about measuring, and the gold was in how fast does light go? And it was Michelson who was able to measure the speed of light. And all of this happening about the same time that Einstein is working on trying to regain his health, and Elsa helping him not just to come back and be again the old Einstein, but to be the new better Einstein. And in that lens, Einstein realized that he had misunderstood in his original theory about relativity, the theory of specific relativity, the special theory of relativity, that there was a general theory of relativity that was cosmic, but one had to be in a position to have consciousness raised so that it could embrace the infinite. Otherwise, you would not be able to even use consciousness to characterize it. And so the problem for Einstein at the end of the First World War, how may I refine my lens so that I can be open to infinity? Let's take a little break. Let's come back to a very interesting aspect of science, that science does not take its genesis in the mind. The genesis of science is an ecology of consciousness rather than a cycle of integration. The entire cycle of nature is an integral cycle, and its essential binary is truly 0 and 1. This is why the mind in computers can write almost any degree of exactness in terms of zeros and ones. But the 0 and 1 are not a polarity. The 0 and 1 are a complementarity. They complement one another, and they do it in a very special, natural way. Out of the process of nature come the forms of existence. Out of the process of experience come the forms of the mind. So that it is a very natural thing to have a syncopation of phase states to natural reality. And this syncopation of phase states carries over into consciousness, but whereas nature has a cycle, consciousness has an ecology. It's different. A cycle will repeat and can have variations, but an ecology is not based upon a 0 and 1 binary. Its binary is 0 and infinity. So that consciousness is not only different from nature in the sense that it's supranatural, but it is different in mode from nature because nature is always integral. Though it may have variety and it may have details, it does not have as a strategy for its forms anything other than bringing something together, bringing something into existence so that it really is there, it's measurable, existential, physical, and whether it's things in the world or things in the mind, they're always integrated so that they're there. They exist, they occur, and can have an identity, can have a referentiality to each other. But as soon as you get into the ecology of consciousness, conscious forms being prismatic and having a binary of 0 and infinity, they are open-ended and not capable of being defined. They can be characterized, and the fact that they can be characterized but not definitively bounded means then that the process of science, which is called analytic, that the analytic is infinite as well. That there is no end to what one can find out analytically. And the same holds for art forms, because there's no limit to the appreciability of art forms. And art forms are appreciated not in an analytic, but in a critique. One can refine one's sense of appreciation of art forms, and that the spiritual person is an art form. Radically different from the individuality in the mind. One's individuality in the mind, one's identity, has a referentiality to the body as just its exactness as an existential thing. But it doesn't take rocket science to understand that there are many different developments during a lifetime of that body, and the same thing for individuality, and yet they are always characterized by an integral. Whereas the art of the spirit person is like jewel cutting. It's like prism making. And it is capable of showing the entire rainbow of light, not just what this light is or that light is, but the spectrum. And we talked last week about Niels Bohr coming into his genius about the same time that Einstein did, First World War era and right after it. And we showed his book from Cambridge University Press, 1922, The Theory of Spectra and Atomic Constitution. That every existential atom will have its spectra, will have its peculiar rainbow of what it is. And the three essays in here, the first one is on the spectra of hydrogen, being the alpha of that alphabet. And the second essay on the series spectra of all the elements. The first element is like the pitch pipe key, then the whole piano of notes of all the elements, and the third is the structure of the atom and the physical and chemical properties of the elements. That within that spectra, that rainbow of the possibilities of the elements when they come together, when atoms come together and share electron energy shells, as it were, they make molecules. And not only molecules, very complex molecules. And occasionally, when they are like organic molecules, say like a protein, one has an extraordinary complexity that's there. I showed last week Niels Bohr's grandson, one of his books on protein folds. That proteins do not fold like origami, but they fold in squiggly spirals that organize themselves like some kind of Jackson Pollock spaghetti. And they're enormously complex, and they're able to do amazing things because they can bring out from a line of DNA that has been put into its spiral in pairedness, can read out what that whole spirality of the double helix, when it unfolds into organic physicality, it will be such and such a secretion or such and such cells, enzymes. The whole basis of it is this creative meistering which nature does. Where does nature get that process from? That ability to have that mysterious protein process. And the resolution of that is timeless for our species. It comes because the cosmos gifts it. The cosmos is alive, and not just intelligent, but superconscious. And that nature works this way because it's the emergence out of the actual cosmos that it will generate this kind of energetic dynamic. And so the cycle of nature founds itself in the ecology of consciousness. They're not separable. And so what we're dealing with in our learning is not just a double cycle, but a cycle of nature that integrates and an ecology of consciousness that differentiates, and together, in their complementarity, they occur, really. Not as reality, but really. And not only occur, but they create actualities. So we are quite actual. Niels Bohr, in this commemorative volume on Einstein, 1949, he says, surely a situation like this, where it has been difficult to reach mutual understanding, not only between philosophers and physicists, but even between physicists of different schools, the difficulties have their root not seldom in the preference for a certain use of language suggesting itself from the different lines of approach. And then he's going to talk about his own Institute of Theoretical Physics in Copenhagen that was set up for him. In the Institute of Copenhagen, where through those years a number of young physicists from various countries came together for discussions, we used to, when in trouble, often to comfort ourselves with jokes. Among them, the old saying of the two kinds of truth. The one kind belong statements so simple and clear that the opposite assertion obviously could not be defended. Obvious truths. The other kind, the so-called deep truths, are statements in which the opposite also contains deep truth. Now, the developments in a new field will usually pass through stages in which chaos becomes gradually replaced by order, but it is not least in the intermediate stage where deep truth prevails that the work is really exciting and it inspires the imagination to search for a firmer hold. For such endeavors of seeking the proper balance between seriousness and humor, Einstein's own personality, not his mind, his spirit person, is a differential conscious prism, stands as a great example. In fact, he was voted the man of the 20th century around the world because he positioned his own spirit person as a prism that would be able to give the full multidimensional array of what the cosmos is, only one would have to discover what that not amounts to, but to the realization that it entails a continuing exploration. So that one of the phrases that was used by a master yogi around the middle of the 20th century, Sri Aurobindo, he called it adventures of consciousness. That consciousness is not getting someplace where then you have arrived, but it's an ongoing exploration of possibilities that continue to expand, that as you investigate, as you explore, there is yet not just more to explore, but there is more of more to explore. So that it has a differential exponentiality to it. a similar kind of balance happens. When you go into the natural integral, it means that the integral to singleness will have a special integral structure beyond which will be a transform. The greatest meditator on the planet was the historical Buddha. And we've talked earlier this morning about how prayer purifies the heart and how meditation clears the mind, but it is contemplation that intensifies consciousness. How does one go to consciousness from the mind? How does meditation then shift to a differential mode of contemplation? They're radically different. But contemplation has a wonderful relationality as a process to the process of heartful experience, purifying the heart, so that prayer and contemplation are not parallels, but they weave. But they don't weave things, they weave energy processes so that you get a fabric of complexity that is not a thing, but is a field of energy that is characterized by complementarity. And in order for this to happen in this way, it can't just be integral, it must be balanced with the differential, so that what you get is a higher dimension. So that instead of having space-time, one now has a conscious space-time, a 5-dimensional continuum, which is fertile, which is creative. So that when it delivers a form, the form of the art, the form of the spirit, the form of the person, that form crystallizes out of more dimensions than nature originally had. It now has 5 dimensions, so that the form is like a 6-dimensional form. It's a crystal of 6 dimensions. That the spiritual person really is a jewel. They're not just the individuality. They're not just the character of the experience. They're not just the figure of what they do in their actions. So the classic meditator, the Buddha, was able to bring his meditation mind to a single point. He brought the mind to a single point. In Sanskrit, it's called ekagrata. And in that single pointedness, that one-pointedness of meditative mind, he was able to discern the atomic structure of a moment of thought. It's called a citta. When he thought of it in his enlightenment, it was called a bodhicitta. And the bodhicitta has 16 parts, only 8 of which are discursive, and the other 8 always occur as a trill. They never occur separately, they always occur together, the 8. Whereas the other 8 are distinguishable in a discursiveness. It's like the subatomic structure of a moment of thought. So that when it is expressed as a symbol, it's expressed as an 8-spoke wheel, but the wheel includes not only the 8 spokes, it includes the 8 spaces in between. But the 8 spaces are not 8 spaces in between. They're like that center of the square, which is not in the square. It's that the frame is held up in the midst of a field of space, and it's only an appearance that it's within the square. The frame is integrally real, but the appearance that one now has corralled something in the center is an illusion. Pleasant illusion sometimes, sometimes not. But what is the kicker in it is that if you do not know that what you're looking at is Maya, provisional, and ultimately illusory, if you believe that the illusion is real, you fall into delusion. And when you fall into delusion, the mind now integrates in a destructive way. It seeks then to impose its delusionary structure not only back onto experience, but onto other people's experience, onto other people's lives, onto their characters, onto their feelings, onto their images, onto their language. And even further, to ground that in imposing itself even more regressively on what they do. They must do this. They cannot do this. And so action is corralled into a regressive, habitual, ritual comportment that emphasizes not its possibility of opening up, of transcending, but of being more and more corralled to a karma. Whereas in nature, karma is a phase that one can come through and transform, but in a regressive, delusive mind, its insistence would destroy the integrity of nature itself, if it could, to make it right, to make its own viewpoint right. In his Nobel Prize speech for literature in 1954, Faulkner said, "There might in some nightmare come a time when man is so powerful he will be able to pave the entire planet. There'll be nothing to obstruct his ability to drive his car anywhere he wants. And we'll have little stations where you can get fueled of your food, your petrol, your sexuality, your money, whatever it is, in one pit stop, and then keep on driving around the concreted planet." But he said, even that will be sabotaged because man cannot help being free in his spirit. And it will always find a way to have an utterance because it doesn't have to limit itself to what one could say or write, but it can operate also consciously in silence. And it will occur to him as he's driving along that this is absurd. Einstein was the most peculiar figure, and his lineage goes back not to the Buddha as a meditator, but goes back to a curious thing that happens in complementarity between nature and consciousness. That the way that they come together is the way atoms come together to make a molecule. If you bring hydrogen and oxygen together, the oxygen, having a very complex valence of 16, will require 2 hydrogen atoms to share the electrons, and you'll get water. And everywhere in the universe, water exists as water. One can even see in interstellar or even in intergalactic dust clouds, one can pick up the spectra of water. It's there. And the hydroxyl list now is hundreds and hundreds, many organic, that exist not in primal oceans on Earth-like planets, but everywhere in the universe. The elements are all there. The molecules are all there, all the time. In different proportions, yes, but they're identifiable. And we were talking about how visible light is the pivot of the electromagnetic spectrum. To prove this, one time, a Polish mathematician who lived for many years in the United States, a little guy, Jacob Bronowski, who did a wonderful television series once called The Ascent of Man in 13 parts. Marvelous man. He assembled instruments in a row that would record the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and then he set something in front of the instrument array. And then he showed you on the instruments what this looked like in the infrared, the ultraviolet, the X-rays, and it was only in visible light that you could see that it was a man standing there. And you could see the face of who it was who was standing there, and that we can read spirit personality at the ultimate pivot of the electromagnetic spectrum. That's where spirit personality becomes visible, and it's exactly there that the secret interchange happens. And the interchange is that the electromagnetic spectrum interchanges exactly at that pivot with another spectrum called the magnetoelectric spectrum. Only its energy is about 10 billion times what the electromagnetic spectrum is. If you were a being made out of magnetoelectric materia, you could walk through the physical electromagnetic universe in between the atoms and never touch a thing. You'd be the ultimate Holy Spirit ghost. And all of that was there in the original equations that Maxwell did for the electromagnetic spectrum. But being a dour Scotsman of the 19th century, in Victorian England, they didn't want to have anything to do with equations that solve in the negative other way, because what was the pivot there for them was the beginning of 1. But the true pivot of that is 0. Because from 0, 1 can go either way, and the symmetry holds. And that symmetry holds especially in its rotational chirality. Even on this planet, one finds that rotational chirality. In the northern hemisphere, water will go down the drain clockwise, and in the southern hemisphere, it goes counterclockwise. It is not only a universal principle, it is an actuality that the paired symmetry of chirality of manifestation must then not only apply to objects in space, it must also apply to time. Hence the title, Black Holes and Time Warps. That when you come to a singularity, one comes to a 0 point of the electromagnetic spectrum, but it's also a 0 point of the magnetoelectric spectrum as well. They have not an identity of points there, but that the zeronesses operate as well as infinities. In any logical expression, you can substitute infinity for 0, and the logic is as sound as ever. And the interchangeability of 0, not as a point, but as a pivot, with infinity as a pivot, gives one a sense of presence that is so totally still in one sense, and is so dynamically energetic in another sense, that if there were any mass at all, it would require infinite time for it to be. It would sop up all the energy that there is. And so masslessness is a universal characteristic of that secret transform. It is precisely capable of both being and not being in either of two modes at the very same time. In fact, it isn't just at the very same time, that's a habitual way to talk about it. That pivot now occupies a 0 eternity. And exchange is free there. It doesn't cost any energy It doesn't cost any time. No one is charged for it. Is a gift. So that reality, in actuality, is a gift, totally given. No strings attached, no payments. Einstein, as he got older and older, realized that what got in the way of this was a dogged delusion that was being imposed continuously on human beings and on the world. And the first time that he did something about it was 1921. And he made his first visit to the United States in 1921, and he came with Chaim Weizmann to raise money, this is 1921, for a university in Palestine, the Hebrew University. And in order to do this, he gave a series of lectures, the Stafford Little Lectures at Princeton University, May 1921, The Meaning of Relativity. 12 years later, when he saw what was happening, he was the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics in Berlin, and he was visiting again the United States here at Caltech, and the National Socialist Political Party, the Nazis, Hitler, came into power. He knew that he could never go back to Germany. He spent a little bit of time in Brussels because the Belgians were very close to him, very much the place where he had gone to some of the physics conferences, the Solvay conferences of physics from 1911 on. And finally, he went to Princeton and stayed there the rest of his life because they prepared a place for him. That was a special conscious space. It was called the Institute of Advanced Studies. It's not a place where you are there to teach courses or to grade things or even just to do research in labs, although you can do all of those. What it is a place where pure Theoria operates as a visionary field with an infinite boundlessness. And this is different from an institute of research or of teaching. Different, a university is everything that you can teach to other students. And most institutes are refined versions of that kind of a thing. But the Institute of Advanced Studies was a peculiar place. It was a place that had no limits to what you could contemplate indefinitely. And Einstein was there for 22 years. They never gave him a clearance because he was German-speaking. He never received a government clearance to be a party to advanced research, except that his Theoria, his contemplation, was several generations ahead of the rest of the world. It's only in the late 20th century that physics has caught up with Einstein, has realized more and more what it was that he was not thinking about, not just realizing, but what he had prismatically was able to give us the rainbow. Not just a rainbow of the way in which dynamics occur in fields and energy congeals into forms, but the way in which that deep complementarity has a creative, imaginative quality that flows with remembering. And that in the mind, the complement to that is a mind whose imagination has become the memory. And the only way that that can happen is that there was an exchange. Because memory and imagination are entangled. That's the way physicists will talk now, quantum physicists. How are they entangled? The mind being a structure, any part of that structure is a form. But consciousness being a process, any part of that process is a flow. So that in the mind, the imagination is a structure. But when it goes into consciousness, it becomes a flow. It becomes creative imagining. And it takes the place of what remembering as a process was in consciousness that now exchanges with it and goes into the mind and becomes the memory. So in the mind, the memory can organize images, can organize feelings. One can have a composition of color or sound, music. One can have a composition of images into an image base, into a gestalt cycle, into an idea. So the exchange of memory and imagination between symbols and vision is like this secret making of the molecular way in which reality now occurs. Not as two forms coming into a more complex form, but as a differential process and an integral form having their weaving together. And so what comes out of this is an extraordinary, not new universe, but a completely different realm, a completely different domain, and that's why this education. Because the old educations had no way of being able to learn in this. The best that one could do was to be recommended to do your prayer, to do your meditation, to do your contemplation, and to patiently, over a lifetime or over several lifetimes, to emerge. Except that the sediment of a delusive world is now so caked that it will suffocate life, and so it needs to be changed. So an education like this. There are not only things like liquid crystals and magnetism and optics of molecular crystals. There are things of like a Bose-Einstein concentrate and whole textbooks, principles of condensed matter physics, where at a certain approaching absolute zero threshold, the atoms of different atoms of a material will suddenly work together as a singularity. They behave as if they are one atom. There can be billions of them. They are a single atom. They become what the Chinese call te, oneness, unity. And that the quantization of it is such that now we can make not just close to absolute zero, but on many levels now. Bose-Einstein concentrate is a phase transition in which a macroscopic number of particles all go into the same quantum state. In the 21st century and the following 22nd century, in these 200 years, we are going to resonantly occupy the whole star system. Within about 5 generations, we'll have human beings living everywhere in the star system. It is that particular prism, a star system, which is the true prism through which to see not only the galaxies, but galactic cosmicness. One can't see it from a planet. You can't see it even just from the moon. But from an entire star system, consciously inhabited, not only as a unity, but as a prismatic spiritual form, not a culture, but a civilization. It is a star system civilization that is the expansion of the spiritual person who is jewel-like, who is able to deliver all of this. So a learning like this has a very special place in the future, and coming right on. We're going to, next week, go from this frame of 4 to the next frame of 4, and like we took 2 men this time, Einstein and Bohr, we're going to take 2 women. But instead of going into physics, we're going to go into the peculiarities of biological genetics. And the two women that we're going to take, one is one of the greatest of the current science fiction authors. Her name is Nancy Kress, and we're going to take her Beggars in Spain science fiction novel, which won all the prizes in the world. And paired with her, we're going to take a book about Barbara Mcclintock, who for 50 years patiently worked with molecular and atomic and subatomic genetics with a very special thing, with corn, Indian corn. And she patiently wanted to know, why are the kernels different colors? Is there any way to understand how this happens? And she was an amazing person, because when she started, it was almost impossible for a woman to do research. Men did research. They were the scientists. Besides, she played a banjo in a jazz band. And she did all kinds of things that were kind of outrageous. But one thing she did better than anyone else around here, she could be alone in the presence, not of being isolated, but of perfect solitude. And she learned to see into the corn, into its genetic, into the genes, and there she saw that some genes jump out of the DNA shape they were in before, and they go creatively to other parts of the gene, jumping genes. No one believed her for more than 30 years. Now transposons are the most creative field in biological genetics due to one woman tending her cornfields for half a century. More next week.